Oh, the sheer, unadulterated genius of it all. In March 2024, the strategic titans in Brussels decided they'd finally cracked the code of infinite money. They reached out and grabbed $15 billion of Russian assets like a toddler discovering an unattended cookie jar at a birthday party. It was the perfect plan. No domestic taxes, no political friction, just a quick, high-altitude heist to fund the war effort. It looked like a masterstroke of innovative statecraft for exactly 14 days. Then reality checked in, and it brought a very large, very Russian bill with it. Moscow didn't bother with a sternly worded letter to the United Nations or a pathetic appeal to international law. No, they did something far more devastating to the European ego. They looked at 30 years of European corporate investment and simply hit the delete key. Russia nationalized $120 billion in European assets. Volkswagen? Gone. Shell? Extinguished. Siemens? A memory. 30 years of German engineering and Dutch ambition erased overnight. But here is the punchline that the geniuses in London and Paris somehow missed. China just bought the remains for the price of a lukewarm appetizer.
I'm going to walk you through how Europe just executed the most spectacular strategic faceplant in modern economic history. Cast your mind back to February 2024. The war was grinding into its third year, and Ukraine was burning through cash faster than a tourist in a Monte Carlo casino. European voters were exhausted from writing checks for a conflict that seemed to have no end date. Brussels was sweating under the heat of a looming deficit. And then some bright spark in a tailored suit had what seemed like a world-endingly brilliant idea. Russia has over $100 billion sitting in our banks, they whispered. Why don't we just take it?
From their perspective, it was foolproof. These weren't physical assets Russia could defend with tanks. These were digital numbers sitting in Frankfurt, London, and Paris. Now, this is where the comedy of errors really begins. Legally speaking, freezing assets during a conflict is your standard run-of-the-mill sanction. It's the geopolitical equivalent of a timeout. But actually confiscating them, transferring ownership and handing the keys to someone else, that is a move so unprecedented for a major economy's sovereign reserves that it effectively sets the rulebook on fire.
European lawyers worked 20-hour shifts to craft creative legal justifications that would make a used car salesman blush. They found precedents in tiny, obscure cases and polished them until they looked like international law. In March, the announcement was made with the kind of triumph usually reserved for moon landings. The newspapers called it bold. The politicians called it innovative. The narrative was beautiful in its simplicity. Russia will pay for its own war with money it cannot defend.
For 2 glorious weeks, the champagne was flowing. But what the European strategists failed to consider, or perhaps they were too busy admiring their own reflection to notice, was a very simple question. What can Russia take from us? You see, Russia had $100 billion in European banks, but European companies had been pouring money into Russia for 3 decades. Factories, energy grids, supply chains, and retail empires. The math was about to get very, very uncomfortable for the architects of this brilliant plan. Moscow didn't respond with a tantrum. They responded with 3 moves so cold and calculated that European finance ministers are still wandering around their offices, wondering where their furniture went. Move 1. Russia announced the total nationalization of every European corporate asset on their soil. This wasn't a temporary seizure or a we'll give it back later arrangement. This was permanent. The value? $120 billion. That's $15 billion more than Europe had stolen. Let's look at the human cost that these aggregate numbers try to hide. Volkswagen had been building a kingdom in Russia since the 1990s. 30 years of patient investment, training thousands of workers, and building some of the most advanced factories in the region. In some Russian cities, the VW plant was the heartbeat of the economy. The Russian government didn't just take the buildings, they took the intellectual property, the brand rights, and the machinery. Volkswagen's Russian subsidiary simply stopped being German. Siemens faced a similar execution. They'd spent decades installing the power infrastructure and the rail systems that kept Russia moving. Russia didn't just take the physical tracks, they took the maintenance contracts, the spare parts, and the technical manuals. Decades of market dominance were deleted in a single afternoon. Shell's story is even more tragic if you have any sympathy for oil giants. They had massive stakes in the Sakhalin projects and Arctic gas ventures worth tens of billions. Russia nationalized every single foreign share. Shell went from being a powerful equity partner to being a ghost, without receiving so much as a single ruble in compensation.
And it wasn't just the titans. Hundreds of mid-sized European companies woke up to find their bakeries, their dairy plants, and their retail stores now belong to the state. Danone lost its milk, Carlsberg lost its beer, and Renault lost its assembly lines. Every European company that had played by the rules for 30 years discovered that their government's $15 billion heist had just cost them their entire Russian future.
But here is the truly dark twist. Russia didn't let these factories sit empty. They didn't try to run them with bumbling bureaucrats. Move 2 was the masterstroke. They sold everything to the Chinese at a massive discount. Think about the strategic catastrophe here. European firms spent 3 decades learning the Russian market, training the workforce, and building the distribution networks. That kind of institutional knowledge is priceless. Russia handed it all to Chinese competitors for pennies on the dollar. Volkswagen's market share didn't just vanish into the ether. It was handed on a silver platter to Chinese automakers who kept the factories running and kept the cars rolling out under new logos. Shell's energy projects didn't stop pumping. They just started pumping for Beijing. Europe lost 30 years of investment, and China gained a dominant market position in a matter of months. Then came the second move, which was subtler but far more poisonous. Russia announced that all energy and commodity exports would now be settled in rubles or yuan. No euros allowed, period. Europe assumed this would isolate Russia. They thought the world couldn't live without the euro. They were wrong. The world didn't refuse, they just switched. India set up ruble-rupee mechanisms, China expanded its yuan trade, Turkey joined the party. Within months, Russia was conducting the majority of its international trade without ever touching a euro. The leverage that Brussels thought it held simply evaporated. But the message to the rest of the world was even louder. If Russia can trade with the world's biggest economies without using Western currencies, why does anyone need the euro at all? The answer is becoming increasingly uncomfortable. You don't. It's optional. Move 3 is the one that really keeps the central bankers awake at night, staring at their ceilings in a cold sweat. Russia, alongside its BRICS partners, announced a $150 billion reserve fund. The goal? To provide a seizure-proof vault for any country that doesn't want to be the next victim of Western innovation. Traditionally, central banks hold their reserves in dollars and euros because they are stable. But those reserves are held in Western institutions, which means they can be snatched away the moment you fall out of favor with a European politician. Russia proved this vulnerability to the world. One day your money is there, the next day it's being given to your enemy. For any country watching from the sidelines, the lesson was bone-chilling. Your reserves are only yours until a Western government decides they aren't. Saudi Arabia, seeing this, didn't wait around. They started asking about joining the BRICS fund, not because they hate the West, but because they have $600 billion in reserves, and they just watched $15 billion get confiscated from another oil producer. If it can happen to Moscow, it can happen to Riyadh. So, let's look at the scoreboard. Europe gained $15 billion in seized cash, but lost $120 billion in corporate assets. Russia took a hit, but replaced its partners with a more reliable, less judgmental neighbor. And China? China won everything. They got the factories, the market share, the energy, and a massive boost to their currency's global status without firing a single shot or spending a fraction of what those assets were worth. This is the strategic equivalent of burning down your own house to stay warm for 10 minutes. European firms are now terrified to invest anywhere that might face future sanctions. When Shell says they'll never go back to Russia, they mean it. But they're also looking at Brazil and China with a new squinty-eyed suspicion. This caution means less growth, less revenue, and a slow, painful decline. But the deeper wound is to the euro's credibility. If you're a reserve manager in Indonesia or Nigeria, you're looking at your euro holdings and you're feeling very, very nervous. You don't sell everything at once, but as your bonds mature, you quietly move your money into gold or yuan.
Suddenly, European bond auctions aren't as popular as they used to be. The EU has to offer higher interest rates to get people to buy their debt. Higher rates mean higher taxes and slower growth for the average European citizen. German bond yields are widening, and that means billions in extra interest costs every single year. Even the SWIFT system, the backbone of global finance, is being bypassed. Russia's domestic alternative and China's payment systems are now integrated. By late 2024, more than 60% of Russian trade was happening outside the Western system. It's not just a Russian thing anymore. Turkish and Indian banks are plugging in. Every country that connects to these alternatives reduces the power of the Western financial whip. The European Central Bank's own internal models are showing a terrifying future where the euro loses 30% of its reserve share over the next decade. A weaker euro means more expensive imports and a lower standard of living for everyone from Madrid to Berlin. Reserve currency status isn't about how many factories you have. It's about trust. And Europe just took a sledgehammer to that trust for a measly $15 billion. Some policymakers are admitting in private that this was a catastrophic blunder, but saying that out loud would be political suicide. They are stuck in a trap of their own making. The assets are gone, the factories are Chinese, and the precedent is set.
Lesson 1. Financial weapons are double-edged swords. When you weaponize the system, you break the system.
Lesson 2. Always check what the other guy can take from you before you start stealing his lunch. The math was never on Europe's side. Lesson 3. While you are fighting your neighbor, watch out for the guy across the street who is waiting to buy both of your houses at a foreclosure auction. The $15 billion seizure was supposed to fund a year of war. Instead, it might have cost Europe its financial future. Historians will look back at this as the moment the West decided to dismantle its own dominance for the sake of a press release. It's a case study in short-term thinking and strategic blindness. We are watching the real-time erosion of a financial order that took 70 years to build. The fundamental promise that your assets are safe under the rule of law has been shattered. Now, every emerging market is asking, are we next? That uncertainty is a poison that will work its way through the European economy for decades. European companies built their empires on the assumption that property rights were sacred. They were wrong. And now they have to compete with Chinese firms that don't have those same hang-ups. The BRICS alternative is moving faster than anyone predicted, because Europe gave them the perfect marketing campaign.
The Western financial system is no longer a neutral utility. It's a weapon. And once you realize that, you start looking for a different shield. Europe's brilliant plan accelerated a process that will ultimately diminish its power and prosperity for generations. This is how empires end, not with a bang, but with a series of very expensive mistakes made by people who thought they were the smartest in the room. The cost of this $15 billion ego trip will be paid by the children of Europe for a long, long time. The global financial map has been redrawn, and Europe just erased itself from the center. It's a tragedy wrapped in a comedy, performed by people who didn't realize they were the punchline. This changes everything for the next generation of global finance, and there is no undo button for a mistake of this magnitude. The bill has arrived, and Europe doesn't have the currency to pay.